the light shines in through a crack. Now, I'd like to recognize for an opening statement the ranking member, and the ranking member today is a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, and I recognize Mr. Roy for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I am indeed substituting for my good friend Mike Johnson, who has a conflicting hearing. He's apologetic he can't be here. He's got a HASC conflict, but he'll be joining a little bit later. Look, we're all here with our own concerns about what we saw happen last night. And after last night's failure in the Senate, here we are again. This will be the 7th hearing that the subcommittee has had in 9 months on the Democrats' race-baiting election bills. And that's what these are. Today's hearing will use state redistricting efforts to continue to advance the false charge of voter suppression and threat to democracy. That's what we're going to hear today. There'll be cries that partisan gerrymandering that are conducted by both parties, that are conducted always by both parties, that are racial gerrymandering when they're conducted by the GOP. And these cries are all about crass political power, because that's what gerrymandering has always been since its formation. We can talk about how to make districts more compact, how to make districts better represent the people, but this is all about crass political power and using race for that purpose. But that's not really what bothers me, because that's what I'm used to. It's that this is the cynical use of racial fear-mongering built on lies about bills being passed at the state level. After last night's failure in the Senate, another failed attempt to defend massive legislation that Democrats have unilaterally jammed through the House multiple times now, specifically designed to thwart fully legitimate state reforms that are good faith attempts to ensure ballot and election integrity. Yet they will lie and claim that these good faith attempts are designed to suppress voting. That's not at all what these are about. For example, Speaker Pelosi said about Republicans that they, quote, voted to aid and abet the most dangerous campaign of voter suppression since Jim Crow. This is outrageous. It was doubled down by the president last night, which I'll get to in a minute. This is a purposeful misinformation campaign by my Democrat colleagues and by a Democrat in the administration to lie and suggest that opposing the following is voter suppression: requiring voter identification, ballot harvesting, a practice that risks third parties having undue influence or control on a person's voter ballot, limiting mail-in ballots to requested ballots and requiring IDs to use them, not having perhaps all-night ballot drop options. That was the charge in Houston in a hearing I was in down in the Texas legislature. Having fewer early voting days compared to, say, another state. That's what's at the basis of all these charges, that these things are somehow voter suppression. The misinformation campaign is designed to make Americans believe they are for protecting voting rights. They use that term on purpose, voting rights, because who could possibly be against voting rights? For example, allow me to quote from acclaimed election history and law experts, Jerry West, Nick Saban, Paul Tagliabue and company. Quote, in the last year, some 20 states have enacted dozens of laws that restrict voting access and allow local officials or state legislatures to interfere inappropriately with federal election outcomes. Motivated by the unanticipated outcomes of recent close elections conducted with integrity, they say. These state laws seek to secure partisan advantage by eliminating reliable practices with proven safeguards and substituting practices ripe for manipulation. No doubt these famed election law experts spent the weekend reading the federal legislation for which they were lobbying, because, I got the 700-page bill at 11:30 last Thursday night before voting on it on Friday, right before we got the rule. I assume they read it thoroughly over the weekend, as my staff stayed up into the middle of the night doing, to actually see what was in the bill. I assume, too, that they know, for example, that the bill would lead to completely outlawing or eliminating voter identification. Do they know that 4 in 5 Americans, 80%, support requiring voters to show photo identification in order to cast a ballot? I know my colleagues are sure fine with everybody having to show a voter identification with vax cards all across this country, including the nation's capital. Do they know that Delaware and Connecticut require photo or non-photo ID? And more, I'm certain that they have studied the intricacies of Texas law before disparaging it. I'm sure they spent time looking at that. Or say studied the Georgia election law at least a little better than studying the University of Georgia's, say, defense. Do they know that Georgia has 17 days of early voting? And that President Biden's home state of Delaware only has 10 days? Are we looking at Delaware? This puts Delaware on par with Texas, which notably still has more than Maryland, 8 days, Jersey, 9 days, New York, 9 days, and Connecticut, 0 days. 0 days in that bastion of wingnuttery, Connecticut. Georgia has no excuse absentee voting. Joe Biden's home state of Delaware requires an excuse for absentee voting. Now, look, I'm fine with Delaware having that option. It's actually a reasonable debate. But does that make Delaware the target of this committee's wrath? You don't hear them complaining about Delaware. You don't see the Biden administration bringing Delaware to court. You don't see the Biden-Garland Department of Justice suing Maryland for their district maps, in which Maryland Governor Larry Hogan called it the nation's most gerrymandered map after the state's legislature decided to override his veto. Why are they doing this? Because they have to claim voting rights are being violated to try to save themselves politically. Because they know their radical leftist agenda, in which crime is skyrocketing, opioids are flooding into our country, cartels are empowered, China's on the advance, vaccine mandates are crippling jobs, kids, and businesses, Russia is potentially invading Ukraine. All of that is being rejected by the American people. The truth is that it is easier today for Americans to vote than ever before in our nation's history. Yet Democrats try to destroy the Senate filibuster on a partisan basis to do the following: totally prohibit the use of voter identification, require states to allow felons to vote, create permanent paper ballot requirements, make political doxing targets of donors to private organizations, use taxpayer dollars for political campaigns, and I could go on and on. My Democratic colleagues are not interested in debating any of their failed policies destroying freedom and the lives and livelihoods of Americans, but rather to sow fear. President Biden said just yesterday, and I quote, "I'm not saying it's going to be legit. The increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get those reforms passed." Further, quote, "It all depends on whether or not we are able to make the case to the American people that this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election." Senator Schumer knew he wouldn't pass this bill. This purpose is not the legislation. The purpose is to delegitimize elections ahead of the game and to intentionally divide the country. They spent 4 years on Russian collusion. Now they're setting up the narrative for 2022 to use race baiting to create a toxic environment of distrust to delegitimize a possible GOP majority. And we should be better than that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I'm sorry I didn't catch all of your remarks because I was riveted to the picture over your head. Is that Ben Hogan?
It is Ben Hogan. My dad grew up in Texas, and I played college golf, and Hogan sponsored us. So yeah, that's who that is.
Well, I saw him when I was 10 years old here in Memphis. It was a great moment. He was a great golfer.
Great story.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Roy. Now my pleasure to recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, who might have a picture of Y.E. Tittle somewhere.